Hi, I hope you can hear me. I, I can't hear anything, but I hope you can hear me. Okay.
Puneți întrebări în română și noi le vom traduce, ei vor răspunde în engleză. Cea mai bună întrebare pe care o puneți lui Iain va fi premiată cu o carte gratuită semnată de Iain. Cea mai bună întrebare o va alege Iain, deci să fiți foarte activi la sesiunea de Q&A. Cea mai bună întrebare pusă lui Amir o voi selecta eu și de asemenea veți căpăta gratuit o carte, Porțile Gazei, așa se cheamă cartea lui în engleză, am uitat cum a fost tradusă în română. Ambele sunt cărți extraordinare. Înainte însă să intrăm, mă uit după Adriana dacă am uitat ceva de logistică, nu, cred că putem în substanța dezbaterii și, surpriză, o să începem înainte de a da cuvântul autorilor cu o prezentare făcută de SRI, Divizia Antitero, pe subiectul autoradicalizare. Deci ceva legat de tema dezbaterii de astăzi și o să-l las pe domnul Ovidiu Marincea, care e purtătorul de cuvânt al instituției, al SRI, să anunțe un pic, să încadreze ceea ce vor spune astăzi, ceea ce nici eu nu știu, nici așa, vom vedea ce date ne prezintă, dar e foarte interesant pentru că vom vorbi de acest subiect la noi, deci în zona noastră și în România, unde din fericire n-am avut atentate de acel fel pe care le găsiți în aceste cărți, dar e un subiect care nu poate să ne lase rece și trebuie să ne pregătim și noi pentru anumite lucruri în contextul nostru. Domnule Marincea, doamnă,
Bună ziua!
preluați conducerea.
Bună ziua! Mulțumesc, domnule Ioniță. Sunt Ovidiu Marincea, purtătorul de cuvânt al Serviciului Român de Informații și împreună cu Bormașina o să vă facem o scurtă prezentare despre fenomenul de autoradicalizare, un fenomen care, după evenimentele nefericite din 2004 de la Madrid și din 2005 de la Londra, a căpătat o mai mare valoare pentru cei care luptă pentru prevenirea și combaterea terorismului la nivelul Uniunii Europene și pe întreg mapamondul. Vă propun pentru început să ne uităm la un scurt film de prezentare al fenomenului de autoradicalizare. Durează aproximativ 4 minute și îl rog pe colegul să urmărim acest film, după care vom vorbi. Mulțumesc!
este cofinanțat de Uniunea Europeană. Pentru mai multe informații,
Mulțumim inteligenței artificiale, așa cum ați constatat, cei doi vorbitori au fost făcuți cu AI. Înainte de a da cuvântul, nu știu de ce mă aud cu eco, înainte de a da cuvântul colegei mele, Gabriela, expert al brigăzii antiteroriste, aș vrea să vă spun că, deși nu toți radicalizații sunt teroriști, toți teroriștii sunt radicalizați. Acest termen de radicalizare...
Poate reușim să scăpăm de eco ăsta, să nu ne mai asculte și alții, că e suficient cu câte lume în sală. And one word for Amir, sorry, I forgot to mention at the beginning that we have this short introduction in Romanian, but when we shift to the two others, we'll shift to English. And thank you for being patient with us for a few more minutes.
No, everything is okay, and I'm honored and happy to join this important discussion.
Thank you.
Da, vă spuneam că termenul de radicalizare este folosit pentru acei cetățeni, acele persoane care manifestă o simpatie în favoarea unor
I think I know the
organizații
solution. Sorry for the interruption. Amir, can you mute yourself because we have an echo here?
Yes.
Let's try that. Can you mute? Okay.
Acum e mai bine? Nu? Doi zece. Doi zece. Se aude la fel? Cred că au intrat serviciile secrete pe fir. Nu, nu cred. Ok.
Eu încerc la microfon. Cum e? Cu eco. Da, la respingerea valorilor democratice sună cumva poate pompos, dar a respinge dialogul, a respinge ideea că celălalt poate să aibă o opinie diferită de a ta, este clar un semn că îmbrățișezi cumva o ideologie radicală. Frecventarea unor medii extremiste, ori că vorbim de frecventare fizică sau frecventarea unor medii teroriste online, în anumite chatroom-uri sau pe anumite grupuri închise. Și aș dori acum să vorbesc despre platformele de gaming și platformele online, pentru că din ce în ce mai mult sunt utilizate cumva pentru a promova anumite ideologii radicale. Toți ați jucat jocuri, jucăm jocuri, știm foarte bine de diversele jocuri cumva violente. Problema este că aici mai există și persoane care sunt interesate la început, poate fi într-o flatare sau printr-un interes deosebit, să atragă tineri vulnerabili în anumite conversații private și să expună unor ideologii radicale. Există și această atracție a stilului de first-person shooter, care e foarte întâlnit în jocurile online. Și nu știu dacă cunoașteți cazul atentatului de la Christchurch din Noua Zeelandă din 2019, Brenton Tarrant a omorât atunci peste 50 de persoane în două atentate succesive, utilizând tocmai această tehnică de first-person shooter, adică el se vedea ca un erou dintr-un joc online cu o cameră care a filmat absolut tot, a intrat, a mitraliat tot, apoi se întoarce pe cei care mai mai mișcat, s-a mai întors odată să îi mai împuște să fie sigur că au murit. S-a suit în mașină ca într-un joc de urmărire, a dorit cumva să fie urmărit, s-a oprit la centru din Linwood, a mai omorât și acolo și până la urmă a fost oprit de poliție. A trimis cu câteva minute înainte de a comite aceste atentate manifestul lui și crezul lui ideologic, l-a trimis inclusiv pe adresele oficiale cu câteva minute înainte de a comite atentatele, dar maniera în care el și-a construit toată această poveste a fost de erou din jocurile online, jocurile violente, inclusiv maniera în care și-a construit toate armele, ce și-a scris pe toate armele, cum și-a ales țintele, cum a acționat acolo și cum și-a asigurat ieșirea. Deci zona aceasta de first person shooter inspirată din platformele de gaming este din ce în ce mai tentantă, am mai văzut-o și în alte situații. Despre indicatorii fizici, cumva, vizuali, ne referim la cei clasici. Dacă există o schimbare a modului în care ne îmbrăcăm, o mai mare aderență spre un anumit stil vestimentar sau spre anumite însemne, exact cum spunea și domnul Marincea, însemne vizibile ale unor organizații teroriste, sau ultimii indicatori ar fi cei de retorică și discursiv. De la ce spuneam la început, de la respingerea dialogului și un discurs bazat cumva pe ură, hate speech, sau un discurs vorbim cu o persoană și deodată aceasta nu mai sună ca ea, sună de parcă ar cita din ceva. Este un sentiment ca și cum vorbele nu mai sunt ale acelei persoane, citează de undeva. Sunt cumva artificiale. Utilizarea unor termeni specifici, cele de necredincios, cele de shahid, cele de mujahedin, anumită terminologie care înainte nu era neapărat folosită sau cunoscută de persoana respectivă. La fel, poziționarea aceea antagonistă, noi versus ei. Întotdeauna este vorba despre o luptă, nu este vorba despre un dialog, nu este vorba despre o comunitate, este o permanență poziționare antagonică față de ceilalți. Evident, ceilalți întotdeauna greșesc și, evident, persoana respectivă consideră că are toate răspunsurile. Justificarea violenței și a incitării la ură, pentru că până la folosirea violenței, exact cum am spus, există dezbateri de idei. Atunci când apare violența, când apare incitarea la violență, deja se intră într-o zonă care nu mai este o simplă dezbatere de idei. Accesarea și promovarea de materiale violente, cu conținut violent. Din nefericire, există pe internet materiale cu un ridicat conținut violent și mă refer inclusiv la cele de la atentatele teroriste care au fost comise. Ori că vorbim de cei care s-au filmat cu camerele, cu frontalele pe ei, exact ca în cazul lui Tarrant, ori că sunt cazurile de alte atentate în care s-au filmat. A mai fost un caz tot în Australia când au înjunghiat un episcop și la fel a filmat. Acest filmuleț a fost disponibil pe internet luni bune după, având în vedere că nu s-a reușit cumva să fie dat jos și mai există anumite filmulețe care sunt distribuite foarte, foarte mult. Sunt filme cu un grad ridicat de violență, iar distribuirea lor atât de extinsă poate să inducă și să faciliteze promovarea acestor ideologii radicale. Și mă întorc la jocurile video și pe zona de echo chambers, dacă nu așa și anume tendința ca atunci când adopți anumite idei să cauți numai compania oamenilor care discută și care au aceleași idei. Nu mai cauți compania și nu numai că nu o cauți, o respingi compania celorlalți. Și aceste echo chambers sunt camere în care sunt zone în care tu vorbești, iar ceilalți îți răspunde exact cum ai dorit tu să-ți răspundă. Și atunci chiar ai senzația că acestea sunt adevăratele idei și că toată lumea este de acord cu tine. Trăiești într-o anumită zonă în care nu mai poți să mai vezi altceva și nu mai poți să mai vezi dialogul. Și ca ultimă parte, pentru a nu vă plictisi prea mult, vreau să vă vorbesc de acest program Previzio, programul al cărui filmuleț de prezentare l-ați și văzut. Este cel mai recent program, se află în derulare. Derulăm noi, Brigada Antiteroristă, Serviciul Român de Informații, în parteneriat cu Ministerul Afacerilor Interne și cu Ministerul Educației și vorbim cu profesorii și consilierii școlari, ne ducem și le prezentăm de o manieră mai aplicată cazuri, spețe reale de la noi sau din exterior, indicatori pentru a cunoaște cumva ce înseamnă radicalizarea și cât de permeabilă este inclusiv la nivelul liceelor sau poate chiar și al școlilor generale. Deocamdată avem liceele. Din păcate am avut cazuri în care au existat persoane radicalizate în România. Din fericire, majoritatea acestor cazuri nu au ajuns într-o formă în care să fie într-o formă cumva de interes pentru noi, pentru că ce ne dorim noi este ca dumneavoastră, fie că sunteți colegi, fie că sunteți profesori, fie că sunteți părinți, contează să știți despre aceste pericole. Vă invit să puteți, chiar dacă nu sunteți membri în acest proiect, să vizitați site-ul previzio.ro, pentru că acolo sunt și anumite recomandări și principalele, deși sună clișeistic, principala recomandare este dialogul. Indiferent că sunteți un coleg, indiferent că sunteți un părinte sau că sunteți un profesor, dacă observați anumite schimbări de comportament, cu mențiunea că da, foarte multe dintre aceste schimbări pe care le-am spus sunt absolut naturale și absolut normale pentru vârsta adolescenței și prin multe dintre ele am trecut și noi. Deci când observați aceste schimbări de comportament, rugămintea este să dialogați, nu să lăsați problema nerezolvată pentru că ea nu se va rezolva. Un tânăr, un copil, un om care se va dialoga și care va primi sprijin, are foarte multe șanse, în special sprijin din partea familiei și din partea membrului și din partea mediului de prieteni, poate a unui profesor, are foarte mari șanse să poată să-și dea seama cumva de falsitatea acestor ideologii radicale, să-și dea seama de faptul că există și alte lucruri pe care nu le-a luat în considerare și că atitudinile violente nu sunt ceea ce este normal într-o societate democratică. Dialogul între cadrele didactice și părinți este la fel esențial și la fel consultarea de surse interne și credibile. Nu sunt specialist pe zona dezinformării, dar rugămintea este că atunci când vedeți ceva care vi se pare extrem de interesant, ceva la care nu vă gândeați, verificați și a doua oară. Sunt atât de multe lucruri și știți bine pe care pot să apară foarte interesante. Wow, este ceva deosebit. Hai să-l mai distribui. Verificați. Informați-vă din surse credibile. Informați-vă inclusiv de pe site-ul nostru, site-ul Serviciului Român de Informație. Avem și ghiduri de conduită antiteroristă, avem și întrebări. Într-adevăr, este un site ca al unei instituții care nu poate să pună absolut toată munca pe un site neclasificat. Dar avem acolo anumite recomandări. Site-ul Previzio, sursele interne de la ceilalți parteneri, al Ministerul Afacerilor Interne, rapoarte internaționale credibile. Informați-vă și consultați surse credibile atunci când vedeți că ceva este cumva în neregulă. Eu vă mulțumesc. Nu vreau să vă mai rețin cu prezentare, dacă...
Mulțumesc, Gabriela. Înainte de a încheia, vreau să vă mai spun un... Ok, înainte de a fi consilierul directorului SRI și purtător de cuvânt, am fost jurnalist 10 ani. Domnul Ioniță, vă văd des la televizor. De foarte multe ori nu v-ați radicalizat, din fericire. De foarte multe ori, toate cazurile pe care le-a avut România, puținele cazuri pe care le-a avut, teroriștii erau etichetați, teroristul în șlapi, poate ați auzit, teroristul cu butelie, teroristul salafor. S-a făcut foarte mult mișto despre acest lucru. Și eu, ca jurnalist, am făcut mișto, pentru că, hai băi, în România până și teroristul trebuie să fie ori salafor, ori în șlapi, ori să arate mai ciudat. Persoanele care se radicalizează după portretul pe care colega mea, Gabriela, l-a prezentat foarte, foarte amplu, nu sunt niște persoane care vin din înalta societate, care au o educație puternică. Nu, sunt persoane care au fost marginalizate, persoane care ori s-au automarginalizat, persoane frustrate, persoane pline de furie și da, pot fi încălțați în șlapi, pot să gândească să facă un atentat terorist folosind o puterie, nu sunt îmbrăcați la costum și sigur nu mai sunt organizați în acele celule piramidale pe care le vedeam în filmele cu teroriști din anii 2000. Astăzi, o persoană se poate autoradicaliza în casă, în fața unui computer, uitându-se la filmulețe care, cum spunea Gabriela, din păcate încă există pe internet sau pe dark web, în care urmăresc decapitări și alte acte de violență, se autoradicalizează, nu vorbește cu absolut nimeni și într-o bună dimineață decide să comită un act extrem de violent în școala lui, în facultate sau într-un autobuz sau pe stradă. De aceea este cu atât mai dificil pentru noi, autoritățile, să reușim să prevenim și să combatem acest fenomen fără implicarea activă a fiecărui cetățean care ne poate semnala nouă sau celorlalte instituții implicate din SNPCT acest lucru. Vă mulțumim foarte mult. Noi atât am avut de spus.
Mulțumim. Da, nici eu n-aș bagateliza chestia cu șlapii, pentru că sunt chiar parte din uniforma teroristului jihadist în vestul Europei, dacă ați urmărit, și în Orientul Mijlociu. De chiar aș pune, doamnă, pe lista de, dacă apare unul în șlapii, aș fi foarte atent ce se întâmplă pe la noi. Da, acum cred că există un agreement, dacă puteți lua una, două întrebări din sală, de la tinerii din sală, că cred că e foarte interesant subiectul, după care, da, foarte scurt, și după aia, dar întrebări, nu comentarii foarte lungi, și după aia să trecem la cei doi autori pe care i-am propus astăzi. Dacă e o mână ridicată, da, aici, avem un microfon sau spui tare? Dacă poți tare, că de obicei e o problemă. Da.
Nu am spus teroriști, am spus radicalizați. Terorist spun atunci când este condamnat pentru terorism. În România, condamnați pe terorism am avut numai în condițiile legii 515/2004. În rest sunt persoane radicalizate. Ai spune unei persoane terorist, îi spui terorist în momentul în care a comis un atentat sau a fost condamnat pentru terorism și am avut cazuri în România de condamnat pe terorism. Am avut caz în România de persoană de, cred că avea 18 ani și ceva, caz care este public, care a fost condamnat după multe lucruri pe terorism. Deci acele persoane terorism, în rest au spus persoane radicalizate. Iar da, dacă am spus, poate am spus la Brenton Tarrant terorism, omul a comis atentat terorism, nu este noi versus ei, ei sunt răi, noi suntem bune, autoritățile. Spuneam de noi versus ei atunci când tu, ca persoană, nu te mai regăsești în societatea în care activezi, îi vezi pe ceilalți, tu te poziționezi față de societate. Nu autoritățile numesc îi numesc pe ceilalți teroriști. Nu facem asta în România și nu am avut asta în discursul public și, într-adevăr, foarte bun punctul și observația de a nu cădea în capcana, de a-i numi teroriști pe cei care au alte idei atâta timp cât, exact cum am spus, nu se recurge la violență. Foarte bună observație. Mulțumesc.
Acolo. Nu vreți să păstrăm pentru mai târziu? Nu prea văd legătura cu brigada antiteroristă din România. Păi n-am ajuns acolo, de-aia zic, nu vreți să păstrați întrebarea pentru mai târziu când ajungem la subiectul ăsta? Bine. Altceva?
Corect, dar vă mulțumesc pentru întrebare. Dumneavoastră considerați că teroriștii sunt numai teroriști cumva de sorginte islamică și spuneți terorismul este motivat ideologic, inclusiv în legislația națională, de orice fel de ideologie. Deci, iar acestea erau numai câteva caracteristici. O altă caracteristică, nu este acum cumva locul și nu avem timpul necesar, dar o altă caracteristică este cumva poziționarea istorică în același. Am avut un trecut de aur, trăim printr-o perioadă grea pentru că suntem necredincioși și ne-am pierdut valorile, trebuie să revenim la acel moment. Iar această succesiune cumva istorică a fost folosită în multe ideologii radicale. Nu toate sunt cele poate la care v-ați referi dumneavoastră. Mulțumesc foarte mult!
Propunerea mea e următoarea. Mai este o doamnă scrisă la cuvânt și să ne oprim aici pentru sesiunea asta. Doamna și domnul vor rămâne cu noi până la sfârșit și mai avem la sfârșit o altă grămadă de întrebări când le mai puteți adresa. Nu mai rămân. Deci asta este, trebuie să mergem mai departe, dar mai era dânsa scrisă o întrebare. Da, mi s-a părut că ați ridicat mâna, nu? Că imediat dau la altcineva. Da? Bine.
Aici și aici o să-l rog și pe domnul Marincea, având în vedere vasta dumnealui experiență de jurnalist, nu am expertiză pe acest lucru, vă spun din perspectiva omului care lucrează într-o instituție și în care, dacă, Doamne ferește, ar fi o situație în România, repet, nu am avut până acum, dar dacă, Doamne ferește, ar fi o situație în România, mi-aș dori ca cei care sunt de partea jurnaliștilor să caute exact cum doriți dumneavoastră, să obțină informațiile pentru a face ceva pentru societate. Pentru că acolo și n-am ajuns la această zonă, poate altă dată ar fi vorba de o comunicare în situații de criză și atunci este foarte important să își poată pune problemele pe care vi le-a spus dumneavoastră acum, ce pot să fac și cum pot să informez atunci pentru societate.
Acum ce pot face jurnalistii?
Profit de privilegiul moderatorului înainte să vă pierdem. Să vă pun și o întrebare, și anume dacă la noi, în mediul nostru specific, pentru că noi am vorbit până acum așa, de lucruri care se întâmplă cam peste tot. Deci radicalizare, tineri, tot felul de ideologii din jocuri video, stai acasă, intri într-o bulă de asta de ecou până ți zâmbă tot în cap și nu mai știi ce faci. Dar noi la noi, în contextul nostru, urmărim prin instituții mediile de risc pe care le știm prin analogie cu țări din jurul nostru și mă refer la cluburi de sportivi, special arte marțiale, cluburi de motocicliști, băieți de ăștia care se joacă cu arme și apar pe internet, dar nu izolați. Maci, așa, frumos și chestii foarte atractive, pentru că noi de aici vedem. Deci mediul Rusia, mediul Balcanii de Vest, cam de aici ies. Galerii de-astea cărora le place foarte mult, le plac criminalii de război. Deci noi urmărim sistematic prin instituțiile noastre, avem infiltrați acolo ca să știm ce fac băieții ăștia, pentru că ei pot fi instrumentalizați chiar pe timii din afara țării, nu doar din capul.
Nu pot să vă asigur că atât cât ne prevede și ne permite legea nouă Serviciului Român de Informații, ne ocupăm de fenomen, îl monitorizăm. Asta cu alăturarea celor doi termeni cu serie și urmărit e foarte tricky. Atât cât ne permite legea, da, suntem atenți la toate zonele specifice din România care ar putea prezenta la un moment dat o amenințare. Gabriela, dacă ești tu mai tehnică pe acest subiect.
Vreau doar să spun ceva. Acum, într-adevăr, ne interesează mediile, așa, pentru că avem o abordare preventivă, dar în același timp suntem conștienți de pericolul grupilor singuratici. Și aceștia sunt cei mai greu de detectat. Pentru că, așa cum spuneați dumneavoastră, în medii, ok, un mediu mai, dar pe zona de radicalizare online, așa numită autoradicalizare, e auto în sensul că nu intră în contact poate fizic, dar online intră în contact cu destul de multă lume sau își descarcă anumite materiale, acei lupi singuratici, acele persoane care nu au contacte majore și nu frecventează neapărat fizic anumite medii, acelea reprezintă, din punctul meu de vedere, o zonă cumva de interes, nu doar pentru noi, dar și pentru serviciile partenere care se confruntă.
Bine, nu-mi rămâne decât să vă mulțumesc foarte mult numele Editurii Corint, gazda, Universitatea Politehnică și a meu personal, că a fost absolvent de Politehnică, de fapt îmi place să mă întorc la alma mater. Rămâneți cât noi cât puteți. Acum, now I'd like to shift to English and finally get to the authors and start to speak about the books and about two very interesting books. And I suggest we start with Amir Tibon, who is online from Tel Aviv. And if we can magnify his screen to have his figure on the screen. And if you hear me, Tibon.
Yes, yes. I hope you can hear me as well.
Please, you have probably 5 minutes or as much as you want to present what do you think is interesting for the Romanian audience in your book, and what are your, in your completely atypical and extraordinary book, and why should a Romanian youngster, whether university student or high school student, as we have now in this room, why should they read your book? What do they get out of your book in our context in Eastern Europe?
Okay, I hope you can hear me well and see me well. And like I said, it's really an honor to join this discussion. And I apologize that I could not be there in person, but still, I'm very happy to be speaking with you today. When it comes to your question about the Romanian audience, just something personal. My family is originally from Romania. My grandmother was born there, and her family was murdered in the Holocaust in the 1940s. She survived and later came to Israel. And she continued to speak Romanian, and Romania is important in our family heritage and story. So it's another reason I'm excited to be speaking with you. My book tells a very Israeli story, but at the same time, it is also a universal story. It's a story about family and about community and about trauma and survival. And these are themes that are relevant for many people around the world today. The story is very much rooted in the events of October 7 and how my family and my community, my small kibbutz, I guess you can compare it to a small village on the border with Gaza, experienced this attack. The neighbors that were murdered and killed and kidnapped by terrorists, the homes that were destroyed, the experience of my own family. We had to shelter in a small dark room for 10 hours with a 3-year-old girl and a 1.5-year-old girl, while the terrorists were out in the neighborhood trying to break into the house and find us. So it's very much rooted in the events of that day. But I wrote the book in English originally, and it has been translated since into French and German and Italian and Hungarian and now also Romanian, because it's a story that can appeal to anybody, not just for the purpose of learning about October 7 and the history of Israel and Gaza, which is covered in the book, but also because this is a story that can touch you on a personal level. Like I said, a story about family and about community and about survival and trauma and how to deal with small children inside such a situation. These are things that a lot of times people who read the book, they told me later they tried to imagine themselves in the same situation. You know, you're stuck in this dark room, no food, no electricity, surrounded by terrorists with 2 very young children. What would you do? How would you keep them quiet? How would you keep them calm? So that's, I hope, a good answer to the question of the Romanian reader. Apart from that, the story of the war in Gaza has been one of the biggest news stories in the world over the past 2 years. And I believe it's the same in Romania, like in many other countries. We live in a world where there is a lot of things going on all the time. We still have the war in Ukraine, and we have economic instability, and we have threats of war and terrorism in many different places. And yet the war between Israel and Hamas, the Gaza war, has been one of the biggest news stories throughout this period. And this book tells about the origins of that war, where it started from, what is the background, what is the history that led to it. And I hope it can also help people better understand the story of the war, apart from the emotional and individual and community stories. It also offers what I hope is a valuable lesson in history about a very important subject, the war in Gaza, October 7, and maybe it can even offer some thoughts and lessons for the future Now that the war is over, how can we avoid another one?
Thank you. And for the general audience, for whom you wrote actually the book, for the global audience, what is the main message actually in terms of origins, motivation of political terrorism, and how would you judge the situation in Israel, Gaza territories right now, so where we speak today?
This is a great question. To be honest, I tried to focus on a story and not on a message. I wanted the story to tell and lead by itself. And there are really two stories in this book. There is the story of October 7, of my family, of my community, of my neighbors. And then there is the larger story of the history of Israel and Gaza and the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I try to answer the question, how did we get to this horrible day? How could it happen to us? And what made it possible, if you will? And I think this is an important discussion to have, because October 7, it was a terrible day, and it was the first day of a terrible, terrible war. But it was not a day that has no history. It was not a day that has no context. It was a day that is built on foundations of a decades-long conflict. Decades of enmity and war and terrorism and extremism, and we have to learn that history in order to understand the terrible events of that day and the war that came after it. So I don't see myself as a messenger of a statement or an ideology, but as a messenger of a story. And because I wrote the book for the international audience to tell what happened on October 7, it was very important for me to include the history, because I don't think you can fully understand October 7 without some proper understanding of the history and the context. And so the way I wrote the book is it goes back and forth between two narratives, two timelines. There's the October 7 timeline from 6:29 a.m., when the first barrage of mortars fired by Hamas land on my neighborhood. And then there is the timeline of the history of the conflict, going back to the 1940s, going back to the beginning of it all. And when the two stories move along side by side, at some point they converge, and the history meets the present. And that's what I was hoping to achieve.
Thank you for this. So please stay with us, because now we'll have Iain, who will speak about his book and his message in the book, starting with the same question I asked at the beginning. And I will take questions for both of you. And there will be no time restrictions. So we stay here until everybody has their questions answered.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me here. And so my book is about the history of suicide bombers. And it really goes back to 1881, when the first ever suicide bomber was used, and he blew up the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. So the first victim of the suicide bomber was the Tsar of Russia. And since that time, we've seen around 250,000 people killed or injured around the world by suicide attacks in 68 different countries. And virtually every single religion, every single essential culture has experienced some form of suicidal terror. And so I kind of set off on a journey, which took me to around 23 countries. Along the way, I was captured by terrorists. I interviewed people who really would have killed me had they been able to and given the chance. I've been shot at maybe 5 different times. I've been held up at gunpoint and 5 or 6 different times. I've been in 20 different war zones around the world. I've seen mass death in all of its different terrible forms. And I guess from a kind of a journalistic question, you really want to say, well, what causes this? And to some degree, I think violence comes from the argument of what causes extreme violence from two positions. Either there are some people who just believe man is born evil, that serial killers were born to go and kill people in the way that they did, that suicide bombers are just evil and have always been evil, that the people they come from are evil. And you see this on social media every day. You see people saying, we hate the Jews, or we hate the Muslims, or we hate this group of people, we hate the other. And then there's other people, often liberal academics, who believe that man was not born evil, but man is created through systems, through structures, through society. They were born in poverty. Their parents abused them. They experienced great trauma. And so this group of people might argue that suicide bombers were born from drug taking, or that they were born from extreme poverty or mental illness, and that extreme acts of violence comes from societal pressures. And I guess as I've journeyed through the world and I've met people who have killed over 80 people, and they've sat there and had a lunch in front of me and chewed their meal as they told me how they had killed a mother and children, or I've met a man who had murdered 3 8-year-olds and taken their lives and had no compassion for the lives he had taken. I've certainly met people who I think, you're the closest thing to evil I've ever met. And of course, I've also met people who were abused by their fathers. I've met people who have been raped in prison. I've met people who have been brutalized by war, have seen their entire families killed. And I understand where they come from. And so to some degree, I think it's very hard to say what creates an extremist, because an extremist is created by 1,000 different rivers that lead to that point of extreme anger. But along the way, I've also kind of lent heavily. And when you encounter violence, if you risk death, if people try and kill you, if you see humanity doing the most terrible things, there's 2 routes in life. Either you find a philosophical basis on which you can process that evil, or you suffer from it. You have nightmares, and it consumes you, and you're broken by it. And I've chosen to read philosophy. And I think there are 5 philosophers who give me a guidance on how to understand why extremism happens. The first is one of the greatest of philosophers, Plato. And Plato really argued that violent extremism begins with a claim to absolute truth. Those individuals who are so unshakable in their belief that they have the answer to the world are often those who will embrace violence to achieve that end. And the very first people who bombed the Tsar of Russia, they believed absolutely that if they could kill the head of the state of Russia, that they would cause a revolution that would not be as bloody as the French Revolution, that they would cut off the head of the snake and that everything would follow. And these people, they called themselves the people's will. So they were so convinced of their own righteousness to kill that they called themselves on behalf of the rest of the people. And there's a certain arrogance that often occurs in that framing, but it's certainly a dogmatism. The next group of people, the next philosopher I have a lot of respect for is Hobbes. Now, Hobbes argued that extremism will flourish when legitimacy collapses. In other words, violence fills the void left by moral or political authority. And certainly a lot of the places I've been to in my life have been broken states, places like Somalia, places places like Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh. This is where violence often finds its face because the state has collapsed and there is a real battle for supremacy, where states cannot deliver fairness and the law or security. you often see violent extremism coming into play. The next philosopher I've had a great deal of influence from is Rousseau. Now, Rousseau argued that alienation is a catalyst. He linked estrangement from society, people who no longer found a place in society, with the capacity to then go and create extremes. And I think we've seen that radicalization in Europe. A lot of young Muslim men who have found no place in society have found greater meaning with more ancient forms of power based from the Middle East, far from their own homes from the West. So individuals who feel unseen, who feel powerless, become very susceptible to movements that promise a purpose to them and offer them dignity through their violence. The fourth person I've had a great deal of power from is Hannah Arendt, and she's written very eloquently about the dangers of political extremism, particularly through the prism of the Second World War. And Arendt argues that extremism emerges when ideology replaces judgment. She warns that totalizing ideas, big ideas that encompass everything, can numb moral reasoning, that it reduces our empathy. Extremism, in her eyes, offers a simple narrative that frees you from the burden of thinking for yourselves, and it allows violence to be framed as a form of virtue. And the final person who I've taken a great deal of inspiration from is John Stuart Mill. Mill argued that if you are going to counter extremism, how do you stamp out political and religious extremism? And he argues that you need to do so by restoring pluralism. You cannot destroy extremism through extreme measures. The states often do. They often use an iron fist to destroy extremism, but to do so, you often fuel more extremism. Instead, Mill would argue that stable societies need open debate, they need fairness, they need shared institutions, and that resilience grows when people trust that grievances can be resolved not through violence, but through the systems of governance that are fair and democratic. And I think those five philosophers have really given me the journey through understanding the history of the suicide bomber and the history of political violence in the 21st and 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's pretty clear that Iain, I presented him as an investigative journalist, which he is, and a great traveler in funny places. But he's also a university teacher, and I think it was pretty obvious. So there's theory in the book, not just adventures in the Wild East. So I strongly recommend that you buy it. And then I open now the discussion for both writers. I see 1, 2, 3, and I'll take batches of 3 questions. But I will raise the first one, again, abusing my privilege. And this is for both authors. And my question is simple. In your book, what is the one thing that your book reveals about terrorism, political terrorism, that the general public refuses actually to believe or to understand? So what is that one thing that you are frustrated that the public doesn't understand about political terrorism, the general public, or the majority? And let's start with Iain and go to Amir then, because he needs his online himself, he won't start to understand and to prepare.
I mean, I think if I said the word suicide bomber to most people, they probably would immediately think of a Muslim suicide bomber. It's become, I guess, the weapon of mass destruction of the 21st century, of all forms of explosive weapons. The suicide bomber has taken the most lives, more so per incident than airdrop planes, more than the bombs dropped from planes, more than tanks and other barrages. The suicide bomber occupies a unique space in taking mass death. In fact, on the cover of the book is the Twin Tower, the suicide attacks in 9/11, which was the largest single mass death of civilians by any terrorist attack that we've ever seen in the world. But what I try to argue in the book is that the suicide bomber is not merely a Muslim construct. It began with Russian anarchists. It then shifted to Chinese anarchists and then became used by the Chinese military against the Japanese. Then the Japanese military used it against the Chinese military as suicide attacks. Then the Japanese military used suicide attacks against the Americans. You saw it emerge in Sri Lanka. You've seen suicide bombings emerge in the Iran-Iraq war. They emerged out of Christian suicide bombers coming out of Lebanon. They emerged out of Shia suicide bombers, which are different from Sunnis. There's Sunnis and Shias are two different sects of Islam. There are Shia suicide bombers. There are Sunni suicide bombers. And so we've seen lots of different communities having recourse to suicidal terror. What I think is possibly the greatest challenge in the modern age to stop Salafist jihadist suicide bombings, i.e. the suicide bombings that we saw in 9/11, the suicide bombings used by ISIS, the suicide bombings of religious, fanatical religious extremism that Israel has suffered a great deal from. The great challenge of that is that one of the fundamental framings of that religion is they believe that once they've died for a martyrdom cause, they will find a place in heaven. And that allure of having a promise of reward, the reason I call this the price of paradise, is to gain access to paradise, you have to die, you have to martyr yourself to then be assured that you will get a place in paradise. And I think that's one of the great challenges and the defining features of the modern Muslim suicide bomber. But that suicide bomber finds links and backgrounds to previous non-Islamic suicidal terror. And I think only by understanding that we're all capable of extreme ideology, we're all capable of the potential for violence in that way, that we can then understand that there needs to be more than one way to challenge a suicide bomber. And that ultimately, if we seek to try and stamp out suicide bombing with draconian state-imposed violence, then the danger is you create more suicide bomber and more terrorism going forward. So there's a balancing act on how you overcome the suicidal terror.
Thank you. Indeed, we ourselves had our share of suicidal killers in the 30s, if you remember, they were Christian also. So yes, we all contribute to it. Amir, so what is your take on this question? What are you most frustrated about that people don't understand about political terrorism?
I think we've seen since the October 7 attack an attempt to erase or minimize or even justify the atrocities of that day with different politically motivated explanations. And it's important to understand that regardless of your opinion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about the occupation, the two-state solution, all of these very important issues, none of it can be served in any way as a justification for what the terrorists did on October 7. What they did, and if you read my book, I describe just what happened in one community, in my own village, my own kibbutz, with terrorists moving from door to door, murdering children, kidnapping Holocaust survivors, using terrible violence against innocent people. This does not in any way promote the national Palestinian cause, the issue of the two-state solution, of independence for the Palestinians. If anything, it caused immense damage to the Palestinians because this was the opening shot of the Gaza war, which has been a total disaster and devastation for the 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And I think it's important to separate legitimate political issues and struggles from the question of terrorism as a method of action, of coming into a civilian community, murdering people, kidnapping innocent people. This is not armed struggle or resistance. This is murder. This is a crime. This is something that is done out of extremism and hatred. And if you will read my book, you will see where I stand personally and most of my community on the thorny political issues I mentioned. Because my community is considered a more liberal, progressive community in the political dimension in Israel. And there are stories in the book about neighbors of mine who volunteered helping people from Gaza reach Israeli hospitals and get treatment in cancer and diabetes and other illnesses that are not properly treated in Gaza. So people from my community volunteered to pick up children and elderly sick people from Gaza and drive them to hospitals in Israel where they could get the right treatment. And some of these people, they were injured and members of their family were murdered later on October 7th. Terrorism does not distinguish between people on October 7. I also detail in the book, most of the victims were Israeli Jews, but not all of them. There were Muslims murdered on October 7 and Christians, Arab citizens of Israel, Thai and Nepalese workers who came to work in Israel in agriculture. In my own kibbutz, a young man from Tanzania in Africa who was a student in Israel and lived on our kibbutz was murdered, and his body was then abused and taken into Gaza, and only recently, after 2 years, he was returned for burial. Think about the torment of this young man's family. Joshua Molel was his name. The torment his family went through. How is this advancing the interest of the Palestinians to murder this young man and kidnap his body and hold it for 2 years while his family does not get answers? So this is an important distinction that I want to make. You can have different political points of view and you can fight for political purposes, and a political fight is not polite. Political fight, you use strong language and you take to the streets and you can do many other things. Terrorism should not be part of this discussion and should not be justified with these important issues.
Thank you, Amir. And as we promised, now we take questions. There was one here, one there. Three again. In this order, please. And you. But I think Amir needs to hear you, so we need the microphone.
Okay, let me know, Mr. Tibon, if you can hear me. Okay, great. I have a question for both of you. Mr. Tibon, Mr. Overton, your books show relevant insight on how violence destroys homes, scars communities, and creates fear. And fear is a vehicle for governments to justify preventive wars, mass surveillance, and extreme measures. It opens a discussion on the Israeli suffering, and it opens a discussion on terrorism and the impact on the world. I want to open a discussion about Palestinian people and how their side of the story has been affected. Mr. Tibon, you've survived the attack on October 7th and lived to tell your story from a both personal and historical way. I want to be very clear where I stand. I believe that my country has a historical duty to its Jewish and Roma communities, which have been massacred during the Holocaust. So fighting against anti-Semitism is still relevant and necessary today. Dr. Overton, in 2023, you taught a group of students with disabilities living in Gaza how to use social media to tell their story. Then their university was bombed on the 11th of October and 16,000 students displaced. You posted a video on your X account presenting their lives before and after the war, the hardships they faced as refugees with disabilities. You have been vocal on the situation in Gaza and wrote an article, "The Haunting Why Britain's Role in the Violence of Gaza Will Come Back to Weigh Upon Us," criticizing the British government for approving nearly £500 million in arms exports to Israel. You have been both affected in polar opposite ways by this conflict. You have both stressed the need for the violence to stop. My question is, how deeply has the violence between Israel and Palestine divided our world? How has Palestinian side of the story been affected by Islamophobia? And how do you see a future for the two-state solution? And more importantly, a future for the world around this two-state solution, where people are called terrorists and anti-Semitic for pointing out the disproportionate response on Israel's case. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask people in the room first to identify yourself and keep your questions short. So please, identify yourself. Okay. Institutionally, you are a student here. Yeah, okay.
So it's a very good question, and you've researched me very well. So I guess the one witnesses, one of the fundamental features of my book was to not only comment on what suicide bombers have done in history, but also the consequence to suicide attacks. So I highlighted three instances. So the first suicide bomb victim was Alexander II of Russia. When Alexander II of Russia was killed, he was a relative liberalizing force in Russian politics. Not an extreme liberalizing force, but Russia was slowly getting to the position of addressing some of the great social problems that late 19th century Russia had. The moment he was killed by terrorism, his son, Alexander III, came into power and basically started executing a lot of radicals and a lot of reformists. And there was one young man who was found guilty of being a saboteur, and he was taken to a street in Moscow, and he was executed. And this was reported in the morning papers. His brother picked up the morning papers and there read about his brother's killing. And that man stood up and went, "They will pay for this." And his name was Vladimir Lenin. And I slightly feel that the preconditions of the Russian Revolution that caused so much death came out of the anti-criminal, the response to the killing of the Tsar of Russia. You have a violence followed by radical clampdowns, followed by radical responses. The second issue was emerged in 1944 in the South China Seas. And there, in the South Pacific and the South China Seas, the American fleet began to be hit by kamikaze soldiers. Japanese soldiers in planes would hit the American ships, and thousands of Americans were killed or injured. And in response to that, the American government, fearing a land invasion of Japan, said, "We won't do that. That'll be too dangerous. We cannot go up against a suicidal nation who are so willing to take their lives in their attempt to defeat us." And under that premise, the American government justified to the American people the dropping of a nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the suicide bomber gave political cover for people to then use nuclear bombs, and now we still see the age of nuclear weapons upon us now. And then the third instance was what happened on September the 11th. This killed almost 3,000 people. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible event. But the consequence of that was around 1 million people killed from places like Iraq to Afghanistan, and over 50 countries around the world implicated in the war on terror. And my point is that when the suicide bomber or the extreme violent terrorist creates a condition that they die in their act of terror, the state has nobody to put on trial because that person is dead. And so instead, the state seeking justice, the state seeking retribution, begins to follow those who assisted that individual, who aided them. And very quickly, you go from the act itself to something deeper than the act, to something bigger. You have the terror of tens of thousands of people killed on October the 7th, yes. But then you have thousands upon thousands upon thousands more civilians killed in Gaza afterwards. And I know it's very difficult to preach restraint, but in my book, I wrote extensively about how Israel has suffered under suicidal terror. But in the counter response to October the 7th, I've also written extensively about how Gazans have suffered. And I think journalists have a requirement to hold states to account. We are not policymakers. We are the people who can say to a state, you have killed civilians. You have gone beyond proper and mediated response. Your response has been disproportionate. And I will do that as much to Israel as I would do that to Hamas. And the sad thing is, I have never been called anti-Muslim by criticizing the suicide bomber in the Islamic world. Nobody has ever called me that. I have been called an anti-Semite repeatedly for criticizing Israel's actions in Gaza. And I find that profoundly offensive because in my heart of hearts, I know I'm not anti-Semitic. I started in a defense of Israel by writing a book about suicide bombers. Since October the 7th, I grieved what happened on October the 7th profoundly. And I wrote extensively about that grief for people I know and love in Israel. But simultaneously, the state of Israel's response after that can legitimately be criticized without the accusation of anti-Semitism being raised, because that is an offense, I believe, to those who have truly been killed under the vector of anti-Semitism. And I wouldn't count myself amongst those. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Amir, would you add something to that? You are in the eye of the storm here, frankly.
I've been writing for the past year, I would say maybe even year and a half, about the importance of stopping the war, saving the hostages in Gaza, saving innocent civilians, ending the suffering that October 7 and the war have brought to so many people. I wrote about it every week, several times a week in my columns in Haaretz, which is the newspaper I work for and the voice of liberal Israel. At the same time, I continued to write about the crimes of Hamas, about what October 7 really was about. And I don't see any contradiction between the two things. It was important for me to continue talking about October 7 and telling the story of October 7 and all the horrors and the atrocities of that day. And at the same time, to continue calling for a deal to end the war and release the hostages and bring humanitarian aid into Gaza and put an end to this terrible suffering. To me, the two things are connected. In terms of the broader political outline, because I think the question touched on that as well, I believe the two-state solution, Israel, Palestinian state, is still the most logical solution, but I'm not optimistic that it can happen in the near future. I think the level of hatred and suspicion and resentment and desire for revenge and fear, just fear, among both Israelis and Palestinians is the highest it has been in my lifetime. And it makes sense because think what people have been through over the past 2 years. Starting with October 7 and into the war, it's been 2 years of a non-stop nightmare. So there is very little room for optimism about peace at this moment. I want to be brutally honest about it. I think it was very important to end the war. It was very important to release the hostages. It was very important to bring humanitarian aid in large quantities into Gaza. And now we still have the hard work ahead of us of turning this fragile ceasefire into a more stable agreement, and stability can open the door to better possibilities in the future. But right now we're in a very low point in terms of the relationship between the two people, the perception of Israelis and Palestinians of one another. I don't lose hope completely, and I'll tell you why. I said earlier my book had been translated into several languages, including German and French. And the German and French editions came out exactly at the same week. So I went for 2 days to Berlin to promote the book in Berlin, and then 2 days in Paris to promote it in France. And when you cross the border today between Germany and France, you don't need to show your passport. You don't need, there is no border signing of, I mean, there's no fence, there's no checkpoint. It's like crossing in the US between New York and New Jersey. And you remember, these are two countries that for many, many decades, actually centuries, but let's say in the more modern time, many, many decades, killed millions of each other's people. Millions. And today, you don't see any border between them. And there is a rivalry mostly in sports. So hopefully we can reach that kind of place in the future, and it will require, in my opinion, that each of the two people will have their own country, their own independence, their basic rights. I think sadly, we are far from that goal today. And October 7 and the war have taken us farther away. But we should not give up, and we should not lose hope.
Thank you, Amir. We have 2 more questions already on the list over there and here. Page, gentle. Doamna Gântureghi. Deci, introducere, nume, afiliere și întrebarea scurtă.
My name is Mara. I'm a first year student at this university. And my question is, you've referred to the genocide in Gaza as a war. You've called it the Israeli-Hamas war. And my question is, how could you possibly claim to have any shred of journalistic integrity after calling the genocide, the relentless massacre and daily deliberate massacres against the Palestinian people committed by Israel, as a war, when multiple organizations, prestigious human rights organizations, have called it a genocide? Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the UN itself, as well as Israeli organizations, your colleagues at B'Tselem have called it our genocide. And my question is, how could you claim to have journalistic integrity by calling the genocide in Gaza, the relentless massacres against the Palestinian people, as a war instead of a genocide? The second question...
And the question is for whom?
Mr. Amir.
Okay.
Another question, he said that...
just one question.
It's very short.
Then we move to this.
It's very short. He said that the 7th of October didn't happen in an echo chamber.
It looked like a statement. You
no,
asked
I
a
asked
question.
him a question. I asked him a question.
We are waiting for the answer now. You raised the question. Now we move to the second person who has a question on the list. And then maybe in the third round, we come back to you. Let's see.
The person
so please give up the microphone to the next person and let's stick up to the rules of the game, which I announced. Please, here. We take just one question from one person. They will answer the question after we finish the round of 3 questions.
I personally don't see how that is possible, since when that person asked the question, they answered instantly.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Ozwan. I am a student.
Keep the question short.
My name is Ozwan. I am a student here at this university. My question is for Dr. Overton. Throughout history, we've seen that democracies exposed to terrorism have used these instances to push their political agenda. For example, the US government, after the 9/11 attacks, used it as a way to promote Islamophobia, bombing the Middle East. President Trump, once a so-called military operation killed al-Baghdadi, said, and I quote, "They shot him like a dog in the street." The Gaza conflict has been running for decades now. It didn't start on October 7, and Israel has used this organization called Hamas to justify their starving, bombing, and overall terror they promoted towards the Palestinian people. My question is, if you think that what you call draconian state-imposed violence fundamentally makes the government just as extremist as the terrorists.
So let's start with the first one about what kind of journalistic integrity do both of you have if you don't call it a Holocaust or massacre?
I will take on it first. I don't want to give myself grades in terms of journalistic integrity. I leave it to others to judge my work. I read very, very carefully all the statements that were mentioned in the question. I did not find it convincing. I do think the war was terrible and caused immense suffering. I wrote about it constantly, all the time. And I called again and again and again to find a way to end this war, make a deal for the hostages and finish the war. I wish my writing and speaking on this issue had been more impactful and brought an earlier result, but I am proud of the little impact I perhaps had by writing this over and over and calling for what I believe was the inevitable way to stop it. That does not mean that I am convinced by the arguments that the war was actually a genocide. I am not. I think it was a terrible war that caused immense suffering and destruction to many, many people in Gaza and in Israel and in Lebanon and in many places. And the fact that I do not call it a genocide, because again, I have not been convinced by the arguments of all the distinguished organizations you mentioned, does not mean I think it was a picnic. I think it was a terrible war, and I'm very happy that it is over. And I kept writing why I think it should have been ended a long time ago. So I hope that answers the question.
So I was just looking online for the amnesty, and they definitely have used the word war in their own articles. Things like weapons of war and the waging of war and war, a famine as war. So the word war, to some degree, has a legal weight to it. A war is defined generally at the UN with over 1,000 people killed in a single year. So when Israel responded to October the 7th, you could legitimately have called that a war because that was an act of self-defense. Obviously, one has to contextualize in much wider framing as to why October the 7th happened in the first place. But I've noticed that this is a commentary that's often used. But me, I've been an absolute critic of the overstepping of the rules of war, and I have still called it a war because I think if we use the language of things like the rules of war, there is potential that we can then go to The Hague to actually talk about the violation of war. So I use war in a framing that one, if we say genocide is one thing and war is something else, and war is more palatable than genocide, for instance, I think we begin to have real debates as to what becomes acceptable and what becomes unacceptable. I would say war in any form is unacceptable unless it's an absolute just war of self-defense. And the moment it shifted in Israel from a war of self-defense to something else, I think questions have to be raised. So I think that there's a big debate around the use of the, not contesting your question, but I think that there's I think being dogmatic saying it's genocide, not war, is problematic for a whole variety of reasons, including legal reasons and the framing of war through like war crimes, for instance. Has Israel committed war crimes? I would argue yes, but if you don't call it a war, it couldn't have committed war crimes. So there's a tension there. This, I think, goes to the next question, which is about proportionality. And the great feature of the suicide bomber is a singular attack where lots of civilians are killed, and then absolute response by the state. And that response by the state, because the state is highly weaponized, it has a monopoly on weapons, it has the capacity to arm itself more, it has allies it can reach out to. In the dying embers of September the 11th, Donald Rumsfeld said that he wanted a global war on terror. He wanted to involve 80 countries in the pushback by the Americans. And this was in the few days after 2001. When I looked at the reach of the CIA and the military's, the American military's placement in 2016, they were active in 80 different countries. It's almost as if Donald Rumsfeld, in the days after 9/11, predicted a global war. And in that global war, a couple of months ago, I was in Basra, and I was sitting down with families whose entire, their children, their sisters, their brothers had all been killed by British troops in acts of violence, not intentionally, but because war brings death. Their families had all been killed by people from my own country. And I had been invited into their homes. They had given me drinks. They had given me cakes. And they sat there and detailed and showed me photographs of 3-year-olds killed by bullets my government had bought, by soldiers paid for by my government. And there was me with their hospitality. And I think that one of the great points I want to make is that when we begin to justify the killings of others as a form of retribution, there is real difficulties in stopping that argument. Why just kill one terrorist when you can kill 10 terrorists? And who cares if 6 of those people are not terrorists? But you still kill terrorists. Who cares if only one of those 20 people killed was a terrorist? It's still justifiable. Who cares if we kill 10,000 people, 20,000, 30,000? And then I begin to wonder, not just at that, the state's capacity, but how the state is often compounded by the military-industrial complex, corporations encouraging states to buy more and more weapons. I detailed how the chief executive of British BAE Systems, the biggest British arms company, got an extra £1 million as a consequence of shares increasing in his company post October the 7th. And he spent that £1 million in buying a flat for his 2 children, your age, in London. That was the flat that Gaza built. So there are profiteers of war. There are people who get entire political careers off war. And there are people who justify war because ultimately it conforms to their idea of them being superior than the people who are being attacked. And so I think that we have to be careful when we respond to terror, that we don't become terrorists ourselves. Thank you.
Amir, would you add something to the second question?
I agree that terrorism must be fought with force, because terrorists are not going to give up their cruel and dangerous ways just if you use nice words with them. And I also agree that as you fight back against terrorism, you don't want to make the obvious mistake of pushing more people toward the side of the terrorists by failing to distinguish and divide the terrorists from the general population. And I think this is a lesson of history in many places, and it is very relevant for the events of the past 2 years. And this is one of the reasons why immediately after October 7, it was obvious to me that Israel has to respond militarily to Hamas's declaration of war, and that the war at the early stages was a just and really inevitable war against a terror organization that murdered and kidnapped so many people. And at the same time, that as the month went by and the immense destruction in Gaza touched on so many people, it was much more difficult to defend the continuation of the war. And that is what led me to also change my view and say what started as a just and inevitable war now must end. And this touches on many issues, not just on the proportionality, but also the question of the hostages in Gaza, which for me was very personal. Friends of mine were kidnapped. I write about it in the book. You can read about their stories. But there is also, again, the question of at what point do you say, okay, instead of weakening the terrorists, I am actually aiding them by pushing more people in their direction and causing more people to sympathize with them and support them. And this is a failure that we've seen just in the recent decades on behalf of multiple countries. And I think it's also very important in the context of the war in Gaza.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for another series of 3 questions. And there's one there. The lady was here with hands up. Thank you. So we start over there at the back. Mai sus, mai sus, mai sus. Deci vă reamintesc. Vă prezentați și țineți întrebarea scurtă, vă rog.
Okay, my name is Răzvan. I wanted to talk. Does this work? Yeah.
And you are from?
I'm
You don't know from.
a student from the university. Okay, so I wanted to say I see we talk a lot about this terrorist problem in an isolated way, but what about the fact that states like America started founding these terrorists and created a lot of destabilization in the Middle East just to support the military industrial complex? And we have cases like Al-Qaeda where we know that the weapons were supplied by the West government in secret. How do we see that, and what do you think about early terrorist Israeli organizations like Habana that were before 1948?
The other one was here.
My name is Anka. I'm a student here at Politehnica. This is my first year of college. And I'm so honored to have the opportunity to ask both of you the following question. Do you think that if people would erase the Bible or maybe the extreme religion beliefs that in the end have nothing to do with the idea of God, the extremism would be at least partially stopped?
The last one.
My name is Andrei. I study at Tudor Vladimirescu National College in high school. And my question is to Mr. Ian Covington. So Osama bin Laden, he joined the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the war between the Soviet Union and the Afghanistan. So what made him really choose the United States as a target, since he fought against different countries?
Okay, so please, Iain, Amir, in whatever your order you want. And I think the first one is very broad and important. So what about the Western contribution to the creation of these movements?
I mean, I think one of the major features of any weapon is it's designed to last a great deal of time. So when the fall of communism occurred in Eastern Europe, Romania and particularly Ukraine became a major repository of weapons that the Russians basically put as a kind of enormous arsenal. And into that vacuum flowed a lot of arms dealers. And they ended up taking a lot of Eastern European weapons and taking it to Africa, for instance. And I had the great misfortune of once being held up by a Somali 14-year-old who was clutching a 1963 Romanian AK-47. So my point is that once you begin to involve yourself in any military framing, there's a real possibility that that will have long-term consequences in a whole variety of ways. And I think that absolutely the CIA trying to find its place in the Cold War between Russia and trying to fight these proxy wars involved themselves in the meddling, whether it was in Afghanistan or whether it was in Iran. The British obviously was trying to maintain a post-imperial economic control. Again, the Shah of Iran. So the British military, the British Foreign Office, the American military, the American CIA have had huge impacts in the Middle East. And I think we're still seeing that to some effect. But I would say that one also has to acknowledge at the same time that Israel has its own capacity for self-governance and responsibilities, that to some degree Palestine also has a responsibility to itself towards ruling its own people. And I think that you need to both contextualize the history of violence as well as ensuring that there is an agency to the people of the now responsible. Because if we merely say everything is the fault of the British or the Americans, we reduce the capacity of people in the now to have that kind of sense of self-fulfillment. I think
the implication was, why did Obama target the US? That was the question.
So in terms of Obama,
no, Osama.
Osama bin Laden targeting the US, which is the thing over there. So again, I think in the Cold War period, America began to involve itself. It wasn't just in the Middle East, it was also in Central America, South America. There were lots of proxy wars. I think there's also arrived at a time when the Middle East was producing huge amounts of oil. And of course, Osama bin Laden, coming from a Saudi family, saw to some degree the oil revenues flowing away from his country, people still living in poverty in the Middle East, at the same time, American influence. And I think in a curious motion, just as some people accuse Donald Trump of xenophobia and racism, one could also accuse Osama bin Laden of the same. You know, these are human conditions. And I think Osama bin Laden had this kind of puritanical belief system, this idea that somehow the past was worth returning to get away from the challenges of modernity. The word Al-Qaeda means the base, and it means going back to the origin. And I think sometimes even in modern day Romania, you are discussing about going back to previous political forms, previous senses of Romanian identity. These are all things that are in the political framing. And if you want to tell people, let's return to a previous form of existence, a previous pre-modern idea, then the best people to criticize is the ones who are offering the alternative, the modern idea. So America becomes the archetype of modern corruption, and Al-Qaeda offers a return to a simpler, purer, easier way of life. And I think that is the promise that Osama bin Laden offered, and ISIS followed up with its own idea of a caliphate.
Amir, your turn. I know you have to get offline in 6 minutes, so please pick one of the questions and address it, or maybe more of them at the same time.
Well, first of all, regarding the United States, I think it would be fair to say that their policy in the Middle East has not contributed overall to creating a more peaceful region. I mean, just look at Iraq as an example. And this is another case in which fighting terrorists was the goal, but the result was strengthening more dangerous terrorists, and the rise of ISIS is directly connected to it. At the same time, I will say that I don't see any other superpower waiting out there to try to do more successful things in the region. It's not like the Russians have a scorecard that they can show which is better. They held up the Assad regime for almost a decade with extreme violence against civilians. I visited Syria, the Idlib province in 2013. I did a big story about it at the time. What the Russians did there to help the Assad regime, it's crimes against humanity. And it was the theater where they tried out what they are now doing in Ukraine. And the Chinese, their involvement in the region today is mostly economic, and they support the same dictators that are supported by the United States. And, you know, it's only a question of who promotes their economic interest. There is no commitment in any way to human rights or civil rights or anything of that sort. So it's completely fair to judge the Americans by the disastrous consequences of their policies, and at the same time to remember that there isn't really someone standing in line to replace them and do better things in this part of the world. All of which leads to the cliche, but still a true cliche, that it is a very, very complicated issue. And regarding the idea of promising a better future through a return to the past, I think this is one of the biggest problems we are facing in the Middle East than in other parts of the world today. The idea that there is some glorious past that can be unlocked if we return to ideas and ways of life that we had hundreds of years ago and are not really suitable for the modern world. I think it's a very dangerous thing. And I want to end with this question about religion in the Bible. It's true that religion is often used by extremists in order to justify actions that are completely prohibited by religion. You know, if you use religion to justify murdering children and raping and torturing people, this is, of course, a contradiction within itself. Religion was also used as a power for good in politics in our lifetime. And if you go more further in history, just look at the civil rights movement in the United States. And if you want to go even more back in history, the abolitionist movement in the United Kingdom, in the United States, that ended slavery, was built on religious foundations. So I'm not against religion per se, and I don't think it is possible to have a world without religion. I'm sorry, John Lennon. But I think there is a real question of how is religion being used, and is it used to promote the ideas that every man and woman are created equal and have rights in this world that must be protected because they are creatures of God? Or is it being used to distribute hate and violence and extremism? I think this is the real question before us, and not the extinction of religion, yes or no.
Thank you, Amir. So probably last word about this Bible thing.
So I think the question of the Bible, or the question of a religious text in the framing of suicide bombing, actually was probably one of the greatest contemplations of my book. And your question is actually goes to the very heart of a real tension I have. So I think I'm a liberal journalist, and so intrinsically I don't want to absolutely dismiss religion as a kind of a fool's paradise, and the idea that people commit violence purely because of religion, because I think that becomes intolerant to religions, and I don't want intolerance. But then again, and then I was slightly, when I first approached the book, I suddenly realized that the first suicide bombers were not religious at all. They were anarchists. I mean, they had a religion of anarchy, a religion of extreme socialism, but the first person who killed himself to kill the king did not believe that he would have a place in the afterlife. He believed Russia would have a glorious future, but he wouldn't inhabit that glorious future. And I think that what I've noted in the book is that religion has the capacity, in religions that do not condemn suicide. So generally speaking, you don't get Catholic suicide bombers because of that. in religions that do have an absolute articulated vision of the afterlife. So I think one of the reasons there isn't many Jewish suicide bombers is because I think that there isn't this highly cultivated idea of the afterlife in Judaism. It's not as articulated as it is in Islam. I think one of the reasons Islam has attracted so many suicide bombers is because it offers unequivocally an idea of a place in Jannah, a house in heaven. You can have 40 virgins. You can have your family around you. You can be offered the rewards of paradise. And I think that that's a real thing. But at the same token, I don't think that extremism only has to have religion to become suicidal extremism. We've had communist extremists. We've had people who've blown themselves up believing that they're going to change the world in terms of climate change. We've had political extremists. And I think one of the things which I think might be a feature of the next stage is as we have more AI and as we see people unable to distinguish between reality and the digital fabrication of reality, I think people might think that they're living in a matrix and that the only way to get out of the matrix is to blow themselves up. And then that resets the computer game. And certainly we saw ISIS using the idea of reset your life and respawn in paradise as a marketing tool to get young suicide bombers to join them. And I think that you may get, in an age of climate change-driven conflict, in an age of mass displacement and unemployment because of AI, I think you may get radical digital extremists who want to destroy the world because billionaires are getting richer and richer and generations of young people are not getting jobs. And I think you may find different forms of political extremism that have got nothing to do with religion, but everything to do with the concept of reality, which is what obviously religion talks about. So I think religion is merely a conduit for us to imagine a glorious past and a potential paradisical future, but we term it religion. Maybe in 100 years' time, we'll term it ChatGPT. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. And we've stayed twice as much as we planned, so 2 hours instead of 1. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, the authors. And I pass the word. Thank you, Amir. Thank you, Iain. I pass the word to the publishing house to tell you how we organize the signing of the books and the buying of the books. So please.
Oh, I thought that, okay. So I